Welcome back to Study Hall, everyone, where we, like we always do, take a look at some dense research and try to kind of break it down and, come out the other end, hopefully understanding the world a little bit better. And today, we're going to be tackling something pretty big, a brand new executive order, and it's all about reshaping federal hiring.
Yeah, this is a big one. Anytime you have a system that's kind of set in its ways as federal hiring is, and you try to make big changes like this, it's going to have some, big ripple effect.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And we have kind of picked out a couple of sources here that we think are going to help us, understand this a little bit better. And the first one is some excerpts from the actual executive order itself. And then we've got this really interesting analysis. And it kind of breaks down, some potential pros and cons. So think of us as your study buddies here, trying to help you ace this exam on federal hiring reform.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. And just like any good study session, you always want to make sure you understand like the why, the why behind all of this.
It's exactly like, why are we even doing this? Why is this reform happening? And Section 1 of the executive order, it lays out the administration's rationale. And, I got to say, the language is pretty strong. They call the current hiring practices broken, insular, and outdated. They even go so far as to say that it subverts the will of the people and puts critical government functions at risk. That's not exactly subtle.
It's, they're not mincing words, are they? It's definitely a choice, to frame this whole thing as like like a threat to democracy itself. I mean, that's probably going to work really well with voters who are already kind of, skeptical of the government and all that bureaucracy. But it also, raises some questions.
Like what kind of questions?
Well, I mean, for one thing, like, who are we talking about here? I mean,
Oh.
if the system is subverting the will of the people, well, who are these people? Whose will is being subverted and like who gets to decide what it means to be loyal to the Constitution?
Yeah, that's a good point. We are already like kind of wading into some murky waters here.
Yeah, we are. We are. And it's also important to remember that, like, this isn't happening in a vacuum, right? There's a long history here of people trying to reform federal hiring. They're always worried about efficiency and fairness and all that and trying to make sure the government is, keeping up with the times. But this one feels different. Like they're really focused on a very specific set of values and ideologies.
So we've got this like, charged language about democracy being at risk and all of that, plus this whole history of, trying to fix federal hiring.
Yeah.
So now let's look at like what they're actually proposing, the actual details of this federal hiring plan, which are Section 2. And oh boy, there's a lot to unpack.
A lot to unpack. Where do we even begin?
Well, one of the first things that jumps out at me is how much they're emphasizing like efficiency, passion for American ideals, and commitment to the rule of law is like, the main things they're going to be looking for in new hires. And those are some pretty broad concepts. Like, how do you even measure someone's passion for something as big as American ideals?
Yeah.
It seems so subjective.
It does. It does. And that's where the rubber meets the road, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how are they actually going to put this into practice? Are we talking about standardized tests? Are they going to have like, interviews where they grill people on their values? And then who gets to decide what American ideals even means in the first place, right? I mean, different people have different ideas about that.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder if this could actually lead to a less diverse workforce.
Yeah.
If they're only looking for people who fit a certain mold of what they think an American should be.
Yeah, that's a legitimate concern. And then there's this other part in Section 2B where they flat out say you can't hire someone based on their race, sex, or religion. And they also say they won't hire anyone who isn't willing to like defend the Constitution or faithfully serve the executive branch.
Yeah, that one really makes me go, It sounds a little discriminatory, don't you think?
Well, it definitely raises some red flags, I mean, on the surface, it sounds good, right? Focusing on merit and all that. But how do you even define what merit means in this context? And how can you tell if someone's willing to defend the Constitution without, bringing their own political beliefs into it? It's a slippery slope.
And you know what? It could even scare some people away from applying. If they think that they have to like hide their true beliefs to get a job with the government, that's not good.
Exactly. You want people to be able to speak their minds and think critically, not just go along with whatever the government says. That's not how a healthy democracy works.
Yeah, it's almost like they're trying to create this very specific type of federal employee, someone who agrees with them on everything.
It's possible. I'm not saying that's definitely what they're doing, but the way they wrote this order, it definitely leaves a lot of room for interpretation and, maybe some bias creeping in there.
Okay, so we've got some potential issues here with the criteria being subjective and maybe some exclusionary language, but there's one more thing in this section I want to talk about. they have this goal of reducing the time it takes to hire someone to pour under 80 days across the whole government. 80 days. That seems crazy ambitious considering how complicated federal hiring can be.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. They talk about streamlining the process using technology, making sure candidates are kept in the loop and all that. But even if they do all that, to get that kind of a reduction in time that quickly, it just seems, well, optimistic.
Optimistic is one way to put it. I'm just picturing all these HR people, buried under a mountain of applications and this clock ticking away,
Yeah.
I can just see them cutting corners and making bad decisions just to try and meet that deadline.
And that's the danger here, right? You get so focused on speed that you forget about doing things the right way, making sure you're hiring the best people and that you're being fair to everyone. And that just undermines the whole point of this reform.
So we're stuck between this rock and a hard place.
Right.
We want things to be efficient, but we also need to make sure they're thorough and fair and, that we're not cutting corners. It's a tough balancing act.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
And to really figure this out, we need to look more closely at both sides of the coin, the good things that could come out of this and the bad things too, because rarely as simple as saying, good policy equals good outcome. The world is messy.
It is, isn't it? And especially when you're dealing with something as complicated as, the federal government. So let's dive into that a little bit more. Let's look at some of the arguments for and against this new approach to federal hiring.
Sounds good. Let's do it. Yeah.
Right.
So, like we were saying before, it seems like this order, it could make things more efficient, but is it worth the cost,
Right, exactly. Like sometimes you try to make things faster and we end up breaking something else in the process. So let's look at, some of the good and bad things that could happen here. And our second source actually does a pretty good job of laying that out. And one of the first arguments in favor of this plan is that, if you have a system that's really based on merit, then you're going to end up with a better workforce, right? Yeah. People who are actually qualified and can get the job done.
I mean, on paper, yeah, that makes sense, right? I mean, if you're only looking at skills and, experience and all that, then yeah, you should be getting the best people for the job no matter who they are or what they believe. But like we were talking about before, it's not that easy to figure out what merit actually means. Like what one person thinks is important, another person might not even care about.
It's like those colleges that are trying to, look at the whole student, not just their test scores and grades.
Yeah.
Even those objective measures like test scores, sometimes they're just telling you, how rich someone's family is, not how smart they are.
Exactly. And then you add in all this stuff about, passion for American ideals, and it gets even more complicated. Like, who's to say what that even means?
Right. It's like, are they just going to end up hiring people who look and think just like them, and that's not good for diversity.
And that brings us to the next argument, right? The idea that this new system is going to be more fair because, it's all based on merit. So nobody can say, oh, you got the job because you're a woman or because you're black or whatever.
It's like everybody knows the rules of the game and it's the same for everyone.
Right, theoretically. But, just because you stop looking at race or gender or religion doesn't mean everything is automatically fair. I mean, some people would say that you actually have to pay attention to those things, because of all the discrimination that's happened in the past. You can't just pretend it didn't happen.
So like instead of making things more fair, it could actually make them less fair for some people.
It could. I mean, true fairness isn't just about treating everybody the same, It's about understanding that some people have had it harder than others and trying to level the playing field.
That's a good point. Okay,
you.
so another argument in favor of this plan is that it's going to make the whole hiring process more streamlined and transparent, right? They talk about making it faster, giving candidates more updates, all that stuff. And that sounds good, right?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, that would be great for everyone. Less frustration, less wasted time, and it makes the whole system seem, less like a black box.
But is there a chance that they'll go too fast?
Yeah.
Like if they're only focused on speed, are they going to miss some good candidates or make bad decisions just because they're in a hurry?
That's definitely a risk, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Imagine you're the person who has to go through all these applications and you've got this deadline hanging over your head. It's going to be tempting to just, skim things and make quick decisions.
And those quick decisions could end up hurting people, both the people applying for the jobs and the agencies that are trying to hire them. So even the good things about this plan, they come with some risks.
They do. It's never as easy as we want it to be.
So we've talked about the potential upsides and, even some of the downsides of those upsides. Now let's flip it around and look at the criticisms. What are people worried about with this plan?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is that, if you stop considering race and gender and all that, you're going to end up with a less diverse workforce. And that's not good for representation, making sure the government looks like the people it represents.
And it could also mean that, the government isn't as good at understanding the needs of all Americans.
Exactly. It's not just about checking boxes. It's about making sure that everybody has a voice at the table, and that all those different perspectives are taken into account when decisions are being made.
Okay, so diversity is a big one. And then there's that whole issue we talked about before with, the criteria being so subjective. Like, how do you measure something like, dedication to American ideals? That's like trying to measure how much someone loves their country. You can't put a number on that.
It's really hard, right?
Yeah.
And it just opens the door for people to, let their own biases creep in, whether they realize it or not. And then you end up with a system that's supposed to be fair, but actually isn't.
So it's like discrimination by accident.
Yeah, kind of. And then you've got this other problem where, if the government is saying, hey, we're only going to hire people who believe in X, Y, and Z, then that might scare away some really qualified people who just don't agree with them on everything,
So you end up with a smaller pool of candidates, and maybe you miss out on some great people.
Exactly. And then the question becomes, who's really benefiting from this? Is it the American people, or is it just, the people in power who want to surround themselves with people who agree with them?
Okay, so we've got these concerns about diversity and subjectivity and, maybe even excluding people who don't fit a certain mold. So how are they actually going to make all this work? How are they going to put this executive order into practice?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting because, it's one thing to have a good idea on paper, but actually making it happen, that's a whole other story.
Right. So let's take a look at Section 3 of the executive order, which is all about accountability and implementation. What does it say?
So Section 3A says that the Office of Personnel Management, the OPM, they're going to be in charge of tracking everything, making sure these reforms are actually working and measuring progress and all that.
That's a big job. How are they going to measure something like dedication to American ideals? I mean, come on.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? And I'm sure a lot of people are asking that, both inside the government and outside the OPM. OPM's going to have to come up with some pretty clear ways to measure these things, They have to define what these big abstract concepts actually mean in practice and how to put a number on them, and that's going to be tough.
It sounds like a recipe for a bureaucratic nightmare.
It could be. And, the OPM doesn't exactly have a great track record when it comes to, making big changes quickly and smoothly.
No, they don't. And this one is going to be especially hard, because it's dealing with all these sensitive issues. And, the criteria are so open to interpretation. It's just asking for trouble. And trouble usually means delays and lawsuits and, politicians fighting with each other.
Exactly. And that's why in Section 3B, they say they have to talk to all the stakeholders, like the labor unions and all that.
Oh, boy. I bet those conversations are going to be fun.
I'm sure they'll be very polite and productive. But yeah, unions are going to be watching this very carefully. They want to protect their members, and they're going to be looking for anything that seems unfair or discriminatory or, anything that weakens their power.
So it's walking through minefield, basically.
Pretty much so. We've got this big, ambitious plan to change everything, and nobody's really sure how it's going to work, and everybody's got their own agenda, and what could possibly go wrong?
That is the question, isn't it? And that's what we're going to talk about in the last part of our deep dive. All right, so welcome back to Study Hall. We've been, really digging into this whole executive order thing about federal hiring, and we talked about, why they're doing it, what they're actually proposing, and we even looked at some of the good and bad things that could come out of it. But now I kind of want to look into my crystal ball a little bit and see what the future might hold.
Yeah, let's put on our, futurist hats and see what we can come up with. I mean, obviously nobody knows for sure what's going to happen, but we can, make some educated guesses based on what we know.
Exactly. So let's start with the best case scenario.
Okay.
Let's say everything goes perfectly. This plan works exactly like they want it to. Everybody's happy. What does that look like?
Okay, so in this perfect world, the government is running like a well-oiled machine. They're hiring all these super talented people. The whole process is faster and easier. And, people actually start to trust the government again because they see that it's actually working.
So it's everybody wins.
Yeah, pretty much. But, there's always the other side of the coin, right? What if this whole thing blows up in their faces,
Yeah. What's the worst case scenario here?
Well, I mean, we talked about some of the potential problems already, right? Like less diversity, more cronyism, people being afraid to speak their minds because they're worried about losing their jobs.
So instead of making the government better, it actually makes it worse.
Right. And that's why it's so important to, keep an eye on this whole thing and ask tough questions and make sure that the people in charge are, actually doing what they said they were going to do.
So it's not enough to just hope for the best. We have to actually make sure the best happens.
Exactly. And that's going to take a lot of work from a lot of different people. It's not just up to the government. It's up to all of us.
Okay. So we've got our best case scenario and our worst case scenario. But, like you said before, the truth is probably somewhere in between those two extremes.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the things that are going to decide whether this works or not?
Well, one of the biggest things is going to be implementation. Like we talked about, it's not enough to just have a good idea. You have to actually be able to put it into practice. And that means having clear rules and, training people properly and making sure everyone is on the same page.
So good leadership is really important here.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And you also need people have to actually want this to work and be willing to fight for it, because there are going to be people who try to block it. They're going to say it's too expensive or too complicated or whatever.
Because change is hard, especially when you're talking about something as big as the federal government.
Exactly. And, this isn't something you can just do once and then forget about it. It's going to be an ongoing process. They're going to have to keep tweaking things and making adjustments as they go along.
So it's a constant work in progress.
Yeah, pretty much. And that means that everybody needs to stay involved. The government, Congress, the OPM, the unions, even regular people like us. We all have a role to play here.
Because at the end of the day, we all want the government to work well, right?
Exactly. We all have a stake in this.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about all the ins and outs of this executive order and, what it could mean for the future. And hopefully we've given our listeners some things to think about,
Yeah, definitely. This is just the beginning of the story. It's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out.
And we encourage all of you listening, to stay informed, ask questions, and, make your voices heard, because this is important stuff. It affects all of us.
It was great talking about this with you.
Yeah, it was great having you here. And to all our listeners out there in Study Hall land, thanks for joining us. Until next time, stay curious.